So we're going to also record this meeting tonight so that we can replay it later on YouTube. And again, that'll be a first for us. So we don't know how well it's going to go, but we'll give it a go and see what happens. Right, so let's give it another 30 seconds and then we'll make a start. I'll see if there's any more people waiting. I must say it's quite nice to see people on the screen. You know, we miss the meetings and this is as close as we're going to get for the moment, I think. So if towards the end of it all you want to ask questions, you can do so either over the chat or you can do it by unmuting your microphone. But what I would ask is that if you finish speaking, you mute your microphone back again. The mute button you'll find is down on the left-hand side of the screen, bottom left-hand side of the screen. Right, I think probably we should begin now, if other people come along and join, we'll let them in as the thing is in progress. So first of all, I'm going to just do a brief introduction and share my screen here. So this is our first meeting, obviously online, and the idea was that we would try and do our future meetings like this. We'd had quite a break throughout the summer going where we're not able to have meetings. And just a word about tonight's speakers. First of all, we've got Steve Helsiger and we've got Martin West, and both are experienced astrophotographers. They're members of our clubs now for quite a few years, but they are also members of the Hartford Astronomical Society, or Astronomical Group as it's called. And they have done this presentation to that society some time ago, and they agreed that it'd be quite a good topic for us as well. And I think that's great. I'm always very interested myself in astrophotography. Both Steve and Martin are really active on Facebook, and you'll see a lot of their pictures there. Maybe you want to subscribe to them afterwards. But I'll leave it to the two guys to talk to you about the topic of an introduction to astrophotography. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over control to Stephen, and hopefully all of that will work all right. So I need now to stop my share. And I'm going to now make Stephen the host. So he is now in control of the meeting from this point.
Evening all. Thanks for joining. Right, first thing I'm going to do is share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, thumbs up. Yeah, good. So I'm basically going to hopefully encourage everyone here to do astrophotography if you haven't already. The idea is yeah, just to basically encourage you to give it a go. Imaging the night sky is very rewarding. It's a great way to learn about what you're capturing. There are many areas of astrophotography which include the solar system, which is basically fast exposures, so planetary and solar and lunar photography, and also deep sky and narrowband. Now, narrowband is what Martin's going to be speaking about later. And you can also do a lot of astrophotography without a telescope. So that's wide field, scenic, Milky Way, and comets, which has been in the news recently. It's also nice to share experiences, gain knowledge and expertise. And post-COVID holidays to dark sky sites. So Martin on the left there, and Tony and Dennis and I, we've been to Spain a few times now, and we have great fun drinking and eating, and some astronomy as well. So astronomy is thought-provoking. It's a really, you know, the first time you look at the moon and Saturn and Jupiter through a small telescope is inspiring. And for me, it gives a concept of our place in nature. And after a day's work and reading the news, it gives a real perspective on, you know, perspective on life and philosophical questions. It all started for me when I was about 17, I think, when I bought this book. It's about 40 years old now, this book. Oh, I need to admit Andrew Ireland in. I think I've done that. So I bought this book when I was 17, and one of the things that inspired me to buy it was a picture on the front. You know, what is that? And you know, I later learned that's the Orion Nebula, and I thought it was just fantastic. So I read this book cover to cover, and I'll come back to this later. So as many here possibly know, when you buy a new telescope, it comes with an additional feature which isn't very well advertised, and that's frustration. You will spend a lot of time figuring out how to get it working, and on top of that, you've got all the other problems. You've got clouds, poor seeing. You've got light pollution, obviously, in the suburbs. I mean, I think we all live in the suburbs here. It's cold. The planets are usually low. Equipment isn't working. I mean, the equipment always seems to work when you perhaps set it up during the day, or when you're in your house. But as soon as you're outside and it's dark, and you know you can see perhaps clouds are coming along, you know, it always stops working. And I think the other thing which is kind of important when you start astronomy is that your expectations are initially perhaps a little too high. But anyway, it generally starts when you're young, you know, and kids, most young kids are interested in astronomy, but usually it starts off with Fortnite, dinosaurs, and if you're lucky, space. And you decide to buy a telescope, and quite often what happens is you think, well, you're only going to buy one telescope in your life. Just spend as much as you possibly can, and get, you know, so you don't have to sort of buy it again, and it'll last a lifetime, you know, right? I mean, as Martin and I have found out, that's completely wrong. You need, you know, we've got lots of telescopes. The other thing is that once you've bought it, you've got to work out how to use the thing. And you know, it does take a while to work out exactly what you're you know, what you're doing. So you make endless frustrating mistakes in the cold. You eventually have your eyes get lighter down. Okay. Right. So screen share. Right. Can everyone see again? Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Yeah. So yeah, telescope's not required. You don't need a telescope. So once you've got yourself a small telescope, you know, you might want to try objects with it. And the easiest place to start is the moon. It's easy to find. It's big and bright, and there are also many kind of interesting challenges with the moon. I mean, you know, the moon's a fantastic object to photograph. Planets, as I say, are often too low. The only exception to that at the moment is Mars, which is a fantastic object at the moment. And the big and bright deep sky objects. So, you know, Andromeda and Orion M42, you know, with your mobile phone attached to the eyepiece, you can produce half decent results. So there's a very small telescope there with a telephone adapter, and you know, you can get pictures of the moon. You can see craters, and that's M42, and you can even see the trapezium stars in there. So you know, it's definitely, you know, a way to consider. getting in there. I've included this slide because I think it's quite interesting, because I keep all my images, and it's kind of interesting to compare your earliest images with your later pictures. Improvements come with time, knowledge, and perseverance. So these are my first images about 5 years ago. So you've got Whirlpool Galaxy there, you've got Mars there, and Jupiter, and some moons. I was, delighted with those when I first took them. And these are just some of my images now. We're basically the same equipment, just a little bit more knowledge. So a good starter camera, and I'll always recommend this, is the ZWO ASI 120. Now, there are two flavors of this camera. There's the MC, which is the color, and the MM, which is monochrome. The color is good for Jupiter and Saturn, and you can actually use it pretty successfully with the moon as well. And, I use the mono version for the moon and solar photography as well. It's slightly higher quality because you're not using the color pixels. I'm not going to get technical at all here, but basically, if you want slightly more detail, it's always better to go for the mono camera. There's various software. Again, in the questions, if you want to ask me about this, I can explain, but Firecap is what I use to capture the video files from these cameras, and AutoStackert stacks the images, and it's a fairly automatic process. That's what the camera looks like. As I say, it's 170 pounds. It's a USB. This is actually a picture of a USB 2 version. They no longer make that. It's now USB 3 version. And you can get 60, 70, 80 frames a second. And that's what you want. You want a high frame rate. That chip is absolutely minute. And you want a small chip if you're just focusing on planets, because the planets are obviously very small. And that's what it looks like on the back of my telescope. For planets, I tend to use a Barlow. So there's a Barlow in there as well. So there's the camera, there's Barlow, and there's the 8-inch telescope. This telescope is 2,000 millimeter focal length, f10, which is ideal for planets. Obviously bigger would be better, but there we go. And again, these are some of the images I've taken with that camera. So, you've got Mars, Jupiter. I took this one of Jupiter 2 or 3 years ago when it was a lot higher. Unfortunately, Jupiter's quite low at the moment. And, it's difficult. And the same with Saturn. I took this a couple of weeks ago, and Saturn's just too low, really, to take anything great. You can try, it's an experiment which didn't work particularly well, but if you take various frames, you can try and animate them. This is an animated GIF. Not terribly successful, but at least you can see the rotation of Jupiter over, and that's only over like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. It's amazing how fast Jupiter rotates. Damien Peach, I mentioned him. This is what he took with I think the same camera. It may not have been, but he took that in Barbados with a beer in his hand and in shorts. And I mean, look at the detail. It's just unbelievable. And look at the detail in the moons as well. Damien Peach, possibly the world's best planetary photographer from Earth. I mean, just incredible. This is just a sequence of shots showing these. I took these of Venus in the early evening over the last sort of 6 or 7 months, which shows the different phases as it's getting closer. So starter equipment is inexpensive and the software is free. Your family and friends will be impressed with the pictures, and you can take them all from your light polluted garden. I just want to cover some moon challenge targets. A montage, something you can do where you stitch individual frames together. You can note changes with time of the moon. The moon goes through a process called libration, which is when the moon, there's kind of a wobble. So although we always see the same face, the moon wobbles slightly, and you can capture that. You can capture the rill in the Alpine Valley. Now that's a real test of how well your telescope is collimated and scene conditions and everything. You can find the Apollo landing sites. That's quite a good thing to do. Craters Messier A and Messier B are good targets, and obviously a lunar eclipse, which was again one of the first things I did. So I'll just run through that. So this is the mono camera. Now you can't actually see that this is a montage. There's about 100,000 photographs in this image, and the way I've made it up is by literally scanning. Each red frame there is about 2,000, between 2 and 5,000 frames with a video camera stacked and then montaged together by hand. It's a very long process. But so, you know, there's a section of the same picture, and that shows you where the, you know, how you need to overlap. You know, you need to move the moon across and take another set of pictures, move the moon across. It takes a long time, you know, but it's quite rewarding when you see a picture building up. So this demonstrates the libration. So there you've got Mare Crisium, quite a obvious feature. And you can see how much it moves. So you can see the wobble of the moon there. There's nothing to do with the phases. It's just to do with the actual wobble of the moon. Alpine Valley, real challenge. So again, here, if you can see craters in Plateau, this is crater Plateau. If you can see craters in there, you know that you've got a good night. You know, the seeing is good, and you've got a good collimation. But this is what you're looking for, this rill here, this fault line in the middle of this valley, and it's just 750 meters wide. And you can see it from where we are. So, you know, it's amazing, really. But you can only see that in ideal conditions, when the sun is in the right place and everything's set up well. So again, so there's Plateau again, there's the Alpine Valley, and this is the Apollo 15 landing site called, that was at Hadley Rill. And in the Sea of Fertility, you've got the Messier craters A and B here. And it's an interesting set of craters. You can see where the impact strike was here, and you've got all the ejecta out here. It bounced up and bounced back into the moon, and then threw all this ejecta out here. So, you know, it's quite an interesting target. The moon is always best at the terminator, which is where night and day on the moon come together. And you've got the best contrast, you know, in the craters at that, you know, where you have the terminator. So, you know, it's always best to look at the craters where the sun is at the right angle, because you get the most definition visually as well as photographically. Lunar eclipse, I took this in 2015. One of the first pictures I took with the telescope, just stuck you know, it's good timing. I stuck an SLR camera on the back of my telescope and just managed to get those at 4 o'clock in the morning. Right, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I've probably got 5 minutes and I'm running out. But one thing that I'm particularly interested in is solar imaging. This is imaging, astrophotography with a beer and a barbecue. It's absolutely perfect. You need a hydrogen alpha telescope, which is something which I have. You can buy them for under £1,000, but for me to be able to study our star is fascinating. That's what it looks like through an eyepiece and through the camera. That's what the video images look like. And so to get the solar prominences, the flares, you have to overexpose the sun itself, and then you merge those two images together. I'm not going to talk about any of that. Not going to talk about that. I mean, contact me if you want to know how to do this, because it's really not difficult. So this is basically the final image, the final mono image that you have. So you have the sun and you have the solar flares, and then from that in Photoshop you can add color, and there's the final image. And again, you know, from your back garden, being able to get an image of the sun like that is incredibly satisfying. admitting Paul Ramsey. Those are the early pictures I took. Again, you know, really not very good. Lots of problems with those, but you know, you learn. But again, being able to capture, I mean, this is when the sun was a lot more active than it is now, but being able to capture the sun like this, you know, from your back garden is great. I was really pleased with this image. I sent it off to Astronomy Now and they published it. And they said it was a stunning shot. I mean, you know, I feel like an imposter. I mean, I haven't been doing this for long, but they still published it. Look at this sunspot, absolutely amazing. So, right, nebulas and galaxies, I'm going to hand over to Martin very shortly. The most important thing is light gathering as opposed to magnification. And the smaller telescopes generally work best at the start. There are two ways of doing this, basically. One is one-shot color, which is what I do. And Martin's method is more complex, but you get much better results. This is my camera here, SI294. It's a one-shot color camera with 60 seconds exposures. With 160 seconds exposures, you can get some really great images. The free software, again, you know, you can look on YouTube. You can see what software you need. If you want to use your SLR camera, it works perfectly well. That's how I started. You use EOS Utilities if you have a Canon, and Deep Sky Stacker, which is free, and Registax, which is also free, and PaintShop Pro, which is well what I use. So Nebula, these are two images I captured while I was waiting for Mars the other night. Very quick and easy. Crescent Nebula and Elephant Trunk Nebula. Pleiades, you know, what you're looking for here is nebulosity, and I've kind of caught some of that. Rosette Nebula, again from my back garden. Horsehead Nebula in Orion, very, very popular target. What you're looking for here is as much nebulosity up here as you possibly can. This is a fairly grainy image. Speak to Martin if you want anything better. Dumbbell Nebula, popular targets. This is when I got my new ASI camera, which is, you know, it's a specialist astronomy camera, which is cooled. The chip is cooled, which reduces the noise. So the quality of my images became instantly better. Pinwheel Galaxy. There was news of a supernova in M61, which I managed to capture here. Again, these things you can do with astrophotography. You can't see it with your eye, but you know, you can capture it. Needle Galaxy, what a beautiful sight that is. You know, look at that, fantastic. Andromeda Galaxy, very popular, you know, relatively easy to capture. Giant globular cluster in Hercules. M51, you know, this is probably my favorite picture. You know, again, you're looking to get this, these are all stars. This isn't gas, this isn't nebulosity, this is stars. You can even see another galaxy there. Interestingly, that's a picture from Hubble, okay, which costs a lot more than my Celestron telescope. That's mine and that's Hubble's. You know, okay, it's not as good, but, you know, it's the same thing. Hubble deep field. This is my version of the deep field. Markarian's chain in Virgo, part of the Virgo cluster. Again, lots of fuzzy white dots. But, you know, they're galaxy. And when you actually realize that it's 65 million light years away, there are 1,500 galaxies, you know, in the local Virgo cluster. And this galaxy here, M87, has 1 trillion stars in it, including that black hole, which was made famous in the news a couple of years ago. This is my best image so far, Triangulum Galaxy. I'm now going to stop. Conclusions. Very rewarding. You can see improved results over time. New technology means astronomy images are far more possible than they ever were from light polluted back gardens. And also what you can do is you can print off a picture, you can hang it on your wall, and when you have people over, you can show people, and it's a nice conversation piece. Next step is Martin, longer exposures, importance of good mounts, guiding, LRGB filters and narrowband. And Martin, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Yeah, great. Apologies for the little technical issue in the middle. You're getting a lot of clapping there. Thanks, guys. I'm suffering from a sore throat at the moment, so I'm not talking much, so you get a bit of rest from that.
Okay, so you want me to go ahead now, Sean?
Yes, please, Martin. Thank you.
Okay, right, so let's share my screen. Hopefully, no. Host disabled, participant screen sharing. Okay, so someone needs to give me the ability to do that.
Sean, you need to make Martin host. Sean, I've handed the host to you, so if you hand it over to Martin. You're muted, Sean.
That's all right, I've got it now.
All right, good, lovely.
Right, where are we? Oops. Yeah. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? Good. First of all, just want to thank Steve for an absolutely superb presentation. I've seen it before, but I really enjoy the sort of photography Steve does. I can't possibly do. I'm useless at taking pictures of planets and the moon. I'm rubbish at that. The problem with astrophotography, it's not a problem, it's just you become specialized in what you do. And I think Steve's astrophotography is absolutely superb, and it's certainly not amateurish, so I find it very professional. So we just do things slightly differently. I'm more into my deep sky objects, especially nebulas and planetary nebulas. But thank you, Steve. That was a brilliant presentation. It's going to be a hard one to beat, but I'll do my best. So I shall carry on. So this is my little presentation about astrophotography. And in my introduction, I'm just talking about the same point that Steve's made about equipment's become much more affordable nowadays, and we're able to take far better pictures than we were just even 10 years ago. So I think that it's something that more and more people are doing, and some of the images I'm seeing on Facebook at the moment are actually incredible. So I really would encourage anybody, like Steve has just said, to have a go yourselves. But this is my sort of take on it. So for me, I'm just going to give a very sort of brief sort of lead in. I'm not assuming that everybody is an experienced astrophotographer, and some of you may not have even tried it or even thought about it. So I just want to talk a little bit about equipment, if I may. So for me, the most important part of your equipment is going to be your mount, because without the stable mount to do your photography, you're never going to get very good results. So I'm just looking at the different types of mount here, and I've done the pros and cons on it. So quite often what we start with is just a tripod, and they're cheap and light, easily transportable, easy to set up. The cons are you're unable to track objects generally, they're limited payload capabilities, and they're prone to external interference like vibration, etc. So the next sort of step up after, if you wanted to move into slightly better mount, is the Azimuth Mount. And the pros for this, it's the next step in mount. It's more rigid, generally cheaper, but not as a strict rule. Easy to use and easy to set up. The cons on it are when tracking movement, you have to move in two axes to actually follow the object that you're trying to do. So not always perfect for if you're doing long exposures or something like that. but fine for planetary work or things where you're taking lots of quick frames. So the last type of mount that we generally use is the Equatorial Mount. So this is set up so it aligns with the rotation of the Earth. So it's properly aligned. One of the axes, you only have to move one of the axes when you're tracking, which is obviously an advantage. Usually the mount is detachable from the tripod or pier. You usually have guiding capabilities, so you have a separate port so you can put a guide camera on and it will drive the mount for you. Usually you'll need some sort of polar lining equipment with it because you need to set it up accurately with the pole star. And the cons with this is they're complex to set up and they can be expensive. What happened there? Right. So I've just done a couple of images to just give you an idea what you're looking at there. So this one here is I need to do this top right hand one is an Azimuth telescope, but it's a computer controlled one, so you can do certain imaging with that. The next one is the computer controlled go to Equatorial Mount here. So this is similar to one of my mounts. So even for just observing, it's pretty good because with your tracking, it will track and follow a planet. But you really, if you're going to do any long exposures, you really need a guide system for that. And then a pier mount. So if you've got somewhere permanent to leave your telescope, a pier mount obviously is superb because it's just not moving. You can set it up at the pole star and generally leave it there and it's all ready to go when you start. So that's our mount types. Little chat about telescopes, if I may, just to give you a rough idea of what we tend to use in astrophotography. The two main types is the refractor, generally smaller and lighter than other telescopes. They're easy to set up, low maintenance. You don't have to collimate them usually unless they're damaged. And they can be cheaper, certainly the smaller scopes. But they are susceptible to distortion at the outside edge of the field of view. Light gathering is more restricted than reflecting Newtonian type telescopes. So the other type of telescope we use is the Newtonian, and refers to a group of telescopes which the following fall into: reflector, Cassegrain, Ritchie-Chern, Dobsonian. There's quite a few more as well. I've just put a few in there for interest. These are good light gathering, but will need to be collimated. I mean, some people don't occasionally collimate. I collimate my telescope every time I use it. It's so important to get everything set right with a reflector. So that's our telescope types. A little picture there just to give you a brief idea how they work. So on the top one is our refractor. You can see the light coming in through the objective lens there, and then it's brought into the focal piece on the eyepiece, or if you was doing photography, your camera would be there, obviously. So that's you reflecting, and then you're refracting, and this is the reflecting telescope. This particular design is the Ritchie-Chern, which is what I use, which is very good for astrophotography. Again, you can see the light coming in through the top, reflecting off a convex mirror there onto a concave mirror, and then out to where your camera or your eyepiece is. So, why do we need to do long exposures? Well, we don't necessarily nowadays, but certainly it was a reason before. Because before we had the CCDs, charge coupled devices, and the CMOS, which Steve briefly mentioned, the complementary metal oxide semiconductors, the only way that astronomical images could be done was on silvered plates on film. So to get enough photons onto that film to see these images, you had these massively long exposure times. So obviously this puts a lot of strain on the system. Obviously, you've got a guide, you can't move things. The Earth is also rotating, which means the skies move to our perspective. So there's various sort of disadvantages, but fortunately nowadays we have the CCDs and the CMOS, and gives us a bit more flexibility. So I'm just going to run briefly down the camera types here, just try not to take too long on this. So we've got, Steve briefly mentioned about smartphones. We're using these more and more now with holders. The phones are improving all the time. So they're easy to use, mounts cheap and easy to set up. The only limits at the moment are the control for exposure and definition. But I mean, I'm sure this will change as they improve. I have used digital compacts before now, because you used to be able to get better or pixels in these CCDs in these particular cameras. But then again, they're slightly better than a smartphone, but not as good as a proper DSLR. So next thing that came along was the video cameras, which I've used before as well, which now become the planetary images. So these take a whole series of fast images and then are stacked together. They're not normally sensitive enough for nebulas and galaxies, but they're great for doing planetary stuff. And then we've got our DLSRs, and these are improving massively all the time. I mean, some of the cameras they're bringing out now are absolutely fantastic. I use both this and a CCD personally. I tend to use the DLSR for finding my subjects, because if I'm using a high magnification, it's very difficult to find what you're looking for sometimes. So if I can find it in another scope here, then I can center it and then bring it into focus for my CCD. So there's a little bit of information there about those cameras. And then we go on to CCDs and CMOS. Now, CMOS cameras have come on leaps and bounds, as you just seen some of Steve's images he's taking now. The advantage of the CMOS cameras is you can have much shorter exposures, but I still like the control I've got with the CCD, and I shall stick with it for now. I think it's a bit like an old friend, you know how to use it. When you try and learn something new, it's a new experience, a new thing you've got to learn. So I'm going to stick with my CCD for now until such time as it becomes out of date. So a little brief chat about setup. I'm a great believer in breaking this into two sections: a daylight setup and a darkness setup. If you try and do your setup at night in the dark, it becomes very difficult to see quite often what you're doing. You're at torchlight. So always about an hour before it gets dark, I normally go out and I'll do my daylight setup. So that will be positioning and leveling. I don't normally have to do that because I don't actually take it in. It's out there all the time. But if you're taking your telescope in and out, then you need to do that. Counterbalance, make sure that your scope is balanced with your cameras on and everything so that it can move freely, especially if you're using power. Laser collimation and reflectors. So if you've got a reflector and you've got a laser collimator, you can do that in the daylight. It saves a job for later on. Find a scope and red dot alignment. So I'll pick a subject which is a long way away and then do a primary alignment if they're not being lined up. It's easier than trying to find stars in the dark, because the points you're looking for are recognizable. Guide scope alignment with primary telescope. So if you're using a guide scope, that needs to be aligned also. Calibration of polar scope. Some polar scopes don't actually go through the center of the mount and they sit on the side, and you have to calibrate them sometimes. And fit all your accessories, like if you're going to use dew control and things like that, make sure they're all there and ready to go, and make sure your lenses are clean, the usual sort of stuff. And then when darkness arrives, we can do our polar alignment for Equatorial Mount, so as soon as we can see Polaris. or if you've got an aligning app with the camera, then you'll do that at that point. Also, star alignment with go-to computers. You can, as soon as you can make out your stars, you can do your 2 or 3 star alignment. Collimation, again, I collimate my telescope every time I use it, but I also do a double check with the star collimation as well, and I'll just talk a little bit about that in a minute. Focusing on a bright star with a Bartonov mask, a way of making sure you get a good sharp image. Select your object in your guide scope and start guiding and begin imaging. Piece of cake. So here we are. This is our polar alignment. So this is what, if you've got a gratical inside, this is a reticle inside, this is what it will look like. If you've got a smartphone, you can just download this application. There are more than one, and it'll just tell you where Polaris is on the clock face here. At this particular point, it's coming about 5.2, and then all you do is move the axes on the mount, not your telescope, until you get the Polaris in the same position, which will be in the same position as it is on the image there. So once you've got it polar aligned, you can then do your star collimation. And this is just a brief sort of show of how it does. In the first picture, you can see that you go to a star and then you put it out of focus, and you can see that the central star is offset to the background. So it's telling you it's out of collimation. So you then move the collimation screws on your telescope. What will happen is that the image will move to one side, but once you've got it in the center, you can recenter it. And then what I do is I'll bring the image in again and do it again until it's almost completely in focus, and you can get it really accurate that way. Right, focusing. So here we have our Bartonov mask. So this sits over the front of the scope, and you can see the outer focus there. You can see the central line is off to one side on the refraction spikes. And in focus, once you've got it lined up, they will line up like they are in that picture there. So there's your focus done as well. Right, so next, guiding. Let's see how we do the time. Right, where long exposure required, we need to do guiding. Unless you've got an observatory standard mount, which are very expensive, start about 10 grand. So they can actually follow an object without having to do guiding, but most of us can't afford that. So we're back to using a guide scope or using an off-axis guider. So I'm just briefly explaining the difference between the two. So here we have on the back, a piggyback guide scope with a camera on it. And in the back, you see you've got a USB lead, and you've also got the lead that goes to your mount. So this scope will actually be moving your mount when you're guiding. It will try and keep the star in position all the time, so helping you guide. Slightly more accurate way of guiding for me, and since I've been using an off-axis guider, I found that my guiding's got a lot better, because you're actually coming through your scope and you're just taking a separate camera off the image with a little prism, and then guiding, so you know that you're guiding on the object that you want, and it saves flex and other bits and pieces you get when you've got two scopes mounted together. Right, a little bit about control. I don't want to go into too much detail if I can help it. I think I'm running out of time already. These are some of the applications I use for control. I use Sequence Generator and Backyard EOS and Nikon here, but there's many others. There's MaxMDL, there's Nebulosity and a few others. But this just allows me to control the scope and the filters I'm using. And I'll talk a little bit about filters in a minute. And then processing, again, there are some free bits of software and some not free. PixInsight is one I just started using. but it's not cheap. Deep Sky Stacker is free. GIMP 2 is free. Affinity is not particularly expensive. Adobe, the rip-off, I think, really, because they charge you so much a month. But it's very good for doing your images. But GIMP 2 is you can do nearly as much with GIMP 2, I think, as you can with Adobe. So for starters, I would use Deep Sky Stacker and GIMP 2 if you're doing Deep Sky. So just briefly talk about narrowband filtering. Well, not briefly, because it's not a subject you can talk about briefly. But just a brief explanation of what we're doing. We're using a monochrome camera, and we're using filters in front of the camera to give us our colors. So you can use your RGB, red, green, and blue filters for certain things. But what I'm looking at is the narrowband filters, and I'll try and explain what they are. It's also known as false color. Something that Hubble has been using to bring some fantastic images, and there's an image there. As you can see, the colors and the depth that you're getting with narrowband images. So why would you bother? Narrowband images carries with it several advantages over LRGB, which is luminescence, red, green, and blue, or one-shot color imaging. Firstly, narrowband filters select out the very distinct part of the spectrum which corresponds with a particular emission line. So in other words, we're picking out the points of interest in the nebulosity or in certain things. So that's the reason we're using them. The only thing with them is because they're cutting out all the other light, that you need much longer exposures with them to get any information. Also, stars appear significantly less bloated, and your nebulosity, as I said, is much richer. In this presentation, I'm just going to look at a monochrome CCD with these are the most common filters used: hydrogen alpha, hydrogen beta, oxygen 3, and sulfur 2. Briefly, just explain what we're doing here. So here's our electromagnetic spectrum. And there's the different various wavelengths. So radio waves, and that's how long they are, right up to gamma rays, the other end, which are subatomic in length. So obviously visible light is that one small section in the middle there. So most popular, well, there's more hydrogen in the universe than anything else. So hydrogen alpha is a really important filter, one that I probably use more than anything else. It brings some fantastic results with that. If anybody's interested in narrowbands, I'm happy to talk to them about using them another time, but I'll just go through this briefly. Just looking at the time here, filter away rather quickly. In most parts, say that we use the hydrogen alpha, hydrogen beta, sulfur 2, and oxygen, and these are the most popular. And then we've got the different palettes we can use also, which I'll briefly talk about. So here's our most popular narrowband filters. So, and there's the part of the spectrum that they are working in, the wavelength in nanometers. So you've got hydrogen beta there in the blue, oxygen 3 in the green, hydrogen alpha in the red, and sulfur in off-red color. And there's some filters there for you to look at, and the wavelength and waveband length. The narrower the filters, the more expensive they are as well. So if you can get lots ones that are slightly wider, up to about 12 nanometers, down to about 2. I've seen some at 2, and they are a fortune. So quick talk about color palettes. The naming function for the palettes, RGB is red, green, blue, obviously. So what you would do if a palette was so if we look at this palette here, we've got the Hubble palette here, SHO, that means sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen in these orders here. So that means that sulfur is the red, hydrogen is the green, and oxygen is the blue. And HSO, which is the European palette, hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen, again, that's the order they're in. So that's all that stands for. It's just allocating those filters to those colors when you're actually producing the images. So here's a Hubble palette picture by Hubble, and and again, it gives almost a three-dimensional effect to the nebulas that you're looking at, which is why it tends to be used. I used to use it in a mix, but now I'm nearly doing all of my images in the Hubble palette. So there's my imaging setup. So for wide field, I use this setup here. Two scopes here. This is 103mm Vixen APO refractor. This is my 62mm. I've actually got this setup like this at the moment because I'm doing some wide field work. So if I'm doing some really big nebulas, I can get the whole thing in by using, this is my camera, my CCD here, my DLSR, and that covered over there is my RC. There's the RC there. Obviously that it does. I'll use this for planetary nebulas and things like this when you need more magnification and smaller objects. And then I just swap this over either side. So on this particular case, I'm using this just to find the objects, and then imaging with my CCD here, which is called CCD QSI. So a few of my images, so I don't go on too long. I'm not doing too bad. So there's a few images just go through here. Took this one. This one's in hydrogen. This one's in Hubble. But this is before I learned how to get the colours to come out properly, so it looks very green. Apologies for that. But we took this in Spain last year when Dennis, myself, Steve and Tony went. I can't normally get this because it's just too low in the sky for us, but in Spain it's much higher up, and I think Steve imaged it as well. We all had a little go at it, and I'm quite pleased with the results, but I do need to reprocess it because the colours are all wrong. This one's a bit more recent. This is the Crescent Nebula. I think Steve showed a quick image of it. It's one of my favourite targets. The reason I love it is because this central star in here is actually a Wolf Ray star. And these are very rare stars. They burn their lives in a very short period of time. And that's all the material you can see around is come from that star. Although it's not exploded like a supernova or it's not ended its life, it's actually expelling material. It's burning at such a rate, it's expelling its material before its death. So that's quite an interesting nebula. That's in Cygnus, in the Swan. It's actually on the line of the Swan, so it's quite an easy one to find. And it's quite bright. Dumbbell Nebula. One of my favourites is doing planetary nebulas. I've been trying to pick up some smaller ones. There's so many. This is one of the brightest ones. Obviously, the planetary nebula, if you know or not, do not know, planetary nebulas are stars like our own sun. That at the end of their lives, they expel their material, they become a red giant, and then they shrink into a white dwarf. And if you look in the very centre of that planetary nebula, you can see a little white dot. That is the star that's expelled all this material. And that's done in the Hubble palette as well, so quite pleased with that one as well. You can see a lot of the material on the outside there. So the materials for here, if you can, the greeny blue is hydrogen. The red, the yellow is sort of sulfury, and the greeny blue is oxygen. The reddy colours are hydrogen, and the yellow is sort of sulfur. Right, this is the Eastern Bowel Nebula. I took this couple of weeks ago. This is remnants of a supernova in Cygnus, and the two main parts of it is the Eastern Bowel Nebula, which is this section here, and the other part is the Western, and then you've got the Pickering's triangle as well, which is all parts of the same object. But I took that with a slightly closer image. One section. That's the Western Veil section of it, again in Hubble palette. So I took that about a month ago, I think. This is the Heart Nebula. Done this one last week, I think, or this week. It was quite a recent one. Yeah, this week I did it on Monday, I think. Very pleased with this. I'm getting to get my head round the Hubble palette now, how to bring the colours out. Again, so the bluey colours are your oxygen, and the yellow, and then you can see the dust lanes in here as well. You can see the dust clouds, especially at the bottom there, and yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. Images are improving as we go along. That one's not quite so good. Star's a bit blobby in that one. I couldn't have had the focus dead right. That's the Sol Nebula, which is just below the Heart Nebula, but not quite so good. That is another planetary nebula. It's the famous Ring Nebula in Lyra. Again, used a Hubble palette for that and got colours out. Quite pleased with that. That's quite a bright planetary nebula if you want to hunt them out. California Nebula. This isn't Hubble. I've done this, I think, just in HSO, but managed to get quite a bit of definition out of it. So cool because it's meant to look like the state of California. It's in Perseus. I think I took this in the winter because I don't think it's very visible at the moment. Steve spoke about the Horsehead Nebula, about getting the nebulosity. So I took this last, I think, November, December time. Again, took this on my Ritchie Chrétien. That's why I've only got a very small section of it because of the magnification on it. But it's quite nice to be able to see the detail on that particular object. This is an old image I took of Ryan. It's not a particularly good one, just to remind myself how far I've come. I'm hoping to do some new ones this year when she becomes a bit more predominant. But the central section is bloated, and although I've got a lot of nebulosity in it, I haven't got the balance quite right yet. So that's room for improvement. Famous Crab Nebula, which is a supernova remnant. This exploded about in 10th century sometime, and it was recorded by Chinese astronomers at the time, so it was so bright it could be seen during the day. It's in Taurus. Again, it'll become more obvious in months coming up now. Sort of halfway between twins of Gemini and the Hades, so it's not something to see with your eye, but you can find it with binoculars. It's just a fuzzy blob if you do find it. Then this is another little planetary nebula. I've been just delving through some more obscure ones. Got this one last month, I think. Quite pleased with it. I'm going to have to invest in a better Barlow or something for this to try and get these images slightly bigger. Yes, again, there's room for improvement there. This is the Cygnus Wall, which is a part of the North American Nebula. Quite pleased with this. Again, this is done in Hubble palette. There's a lot of information there. Star's quite sharp, so yeah, I might have another go at reprocessing that again. And that is that. So I hope that was enjoyable for everybody. I hope we didn't go on too long. And if anybody's got any questions, I'll be only too pleased to answer them.
Great. Thanks ever so much for that. That was brilliant. And you're getting a lot of claps there. If you do have questions, maybe the easiest way is to raise your hand and unmute your microphone so that Martin or Stephen can answer your questions. But just to give you an idea of how we're going to proceed, we're going to take a few questions, but then we're going to move on, and Richard is going to give us a planetarium tour of the night sky, a short planetarium tour, about 10 minutes. So we're hopping around with various speakers, and that really adds to the difficulty of doing this for us. But we're willing to try it and see how it goes. And to do that, Richard will share his desktop as well. So, but before we go to Richard, if you have any questions, you know, please raise your hand, unmute your microphone, and ask a question. I don't see anybody raising hands or unmuting microphones.
Must have bored them.
Yeah, well, I was very impressed by both the presentations from you guys, really good, and the results show it. I've got a question, Martin, about your placement of your telescopes. You put them on your deck, I noticed. Does the vibration on the deck cause any problems for you?
It would do if I stood out there, but I run everything through Wi-Fi. So I go out, do the setup, get everything set up correctly, find the object I'm going to image, then I go indoors and then I'll run everything wirelessly from indoors, so I'm not actually upsetting it. But yeah, it's not the best situation, but the plans are to hopefully move in the next couple of years and buy and build my own observatory so I can do it a bit more seriously.
Well, I must say I'm very impressed with the quality of pictures from both Cuffley and Wheat Hampstead. And yeah, they're great. And I think if there aren't any questions, then we will press ahead because time is moving on, and we'll hand control over to Richard, and Richard will share his planetarium desktop. So what Richard is using, just as a little bit of background, is the free Stellarium software.
Yes, that's the one.
He's just going to point out a few salient features in the night sky. We don't know how well this is going to work. It's a first for us, obviously, but we're going to give it a go and see if we can get something out of it. So I'm going to now just see if I can give Richard host control. I need to take it back first of all. Okay, hang on a sec. Got it back. And Richard, you now have host control so you can share your desktop.
Thank you. Get rid of that. Right. Can we see and hear that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Good. Right. Now, this is a situation that we have at the moment. It's 17 minutes past 9, and we have the night sky, as you could see if you could go outside now, with Saturn and Jupiter, these two planets down here. As far as observing them is concerned, they're both really past their sell-by date, as it were. Jupiter, I had a look at a couple of weeks ago, and the seeing was very poor. But with Saturn, I could actually see the Cassini division with a 70mm refractor, which I'm using now, and I thought that was pretty good. But they are not well seen. Saturn, however, is showing, because it's past opposition, you've got the shadow of the ball on the rings, which makes it a little bit less like a flat picture. You get some 3D feel about it. As far as the sky is concerned at the moment, we still have the summer triangle. I can move this down a little bit. We can get the whole of the summer triangle in. This is Altair, Vega, and of course this one here is Deneb. Now in the planetarium we lost Vega, which as you can see makes a triangle rather like a straight line. However, this is the famous summer triangle, and this will accompany us right into November as it slowly tips down towards the west. There are a lot of interesting objects in this area, and because they're slightly lower, they're a bit easier to see in a telescope like a refractor, where you're looking up a tube, because you don't have to crick your neck quite so much. And this is the constellation of Cygnus, which is one of the constellations that fit into the summer triangle. That obviously is Deneb, and this is the outstretched cross with delta there, gamma, and epsilon, and down here is our friend Alberio. Now, in the newsletter, I mentioned that there were two planetary nebulae, as Martin was saying a few minutes ago about planetary nebulae being very small. Well, one of them, very attractive one, is located here, and that's NGC 7027. It's a very pretty one. It's actually quite a greeny blue colour. I'm sure that makes a very good target, but as far as imaging, as far as visual observation, the colour is the main thing, I'm afraid. Up here, much further away, about here, is another planetary nebula. This one is the Blinking Planetary, as I wrote in the newsletter. The reason that it blinks is nothing to do with the object itself. It's purely due to the fact that the eye has two different positions of on the retina. One of them is sensitive to light, and the other is much sharper. that is the foveal view, the one that when you look straight at something. So you see the star with your foveal vision, but if you sort of slightly look away and use the sensitive spot, you could see the nebulosity, but the star will vanish because that part of the retina hasn't got so many pixels, if you can call it that. So it just records the light falling on it. And that's why you get this curious effect. But they are interesting to compare. Now I mentioned Alberio, and this is probably the most attractive double star in the summer sky. It's easily separated. You can separate it with a pair of binoculars. If you hold them very, very steadily, 10 by 30s will do it. But it's very attractive in a small scope as well. And one of the highlights of whenever you look at the night sky in the summer, you've got to have a look at that, just because it's something that's interesting and it's colourful. I want you to bear in mind that though about this star, because it comes in a few moments when I talk about Mars. When we slowly the autumn night moves on and we begin to see the square of Pegasus. Now Pegasus is not as obvious as it appears here. It's much bigger and the stars look much fainter. But it does have interesting objects to look at. If we take a line out to the star here, this is Epsilon Pegasi. If you move your scope a little bit up here, you'll come to a famous globular cluster, which is M15. It's one of a type of globular cluster that's called core collapse. They are slowly dispersing, because what happens is there's a sort of chain reaction of a few stars leave the outer reaches. The thing starts to contract. The stars, it goes on in a kind of ever decreasing circles, you might call it. Asymptotic, I think, is the word that you could use, really. So that's an interesting object. You can see it with binoculars. It's very nice in a small telescope. I had a look a few nights ago, and it's still there. So that's something that you can look out for. And it's most autumn nut of the globular clusters. The globular clusters tend to cluster up in the Milky Way, which is slowly moving away now. Now we come to Mars. Now Mars is in the constellation of Pisces, which is a rather dim constellation that runs sort of up here and down there. It actually, what you have with the fish, the two fishes are going in opposite directions, and what you actually see is the ribbon that's holding them together. Now, don't ask me why they're held together by a ribbon, but they are, and so you could really call it the constellation of the ribbon of the fish, because you don't actually see the fish at all. But the main thing is that at the moment Mars is situated in front of that area of sky, so it's sort of what astrologers would call Mars is in Pisces. Of course it isn't, but they like to call it that. Now Mars is very interesting at the moment because it's quite a positive opposition, in as much as that Mars is now very large. This is not always the case. Mars has a very elliptical orbit, which means that when the Earth catches up with it every couple of years, it depends where it is in its orbit as to the size of the image that we have. Bear in mind that the planets are small. As Steve said, that all the planets actually are quite small. Mars is really small. And in fact, I mentioned a few minutes ago about Alberio. Well, when you look at Alberio in a scope, look at the distance between the two stars, because the distance of those between each star is bigger than the disk of Mars in a small scope at the moment. Mars, as I say, is a very small world, so if you want to see any detail on it, you have to use a high magnification. At the moment, in my scope, I'm quite pleased to say that I've looked at a few images that I've seen by different people, including this evening, and I'm quite glad to say that visually I can see some of those features, although not nearly as well. But one feature that is happening is that the south polar cap is definitely shrinking. It has shrunk over the last month, And as Mars comes to opposition, we're going to see this because you've got now spring coming into the southern hemisphere, as it were. So Mars is a pretty interesting thing to look at now. You will need quite a lot of, not imagination, but if you look at it visually, you will need to really let your eye get used to the glare of the planet, because the image is very subtle and very, very difficult to see. But it's there, and I have seen it, so I can promise that you can actually see you can actually see some of the detail, nothing like what you see on an image. But nonetheless, it's satisfying to see it with your eye, and then maybe go on and use a digital system. Now, Uranus is also in Pisces. Again, very, very small, much smaller than that. It's about 4 seconds of arc across, which puts it in the gap between the two stars of Gamma Oritis, which is about that same distance apart. You'll see a small bluish, greyish disk, but it is tiny, it looks like a small planetary nebula, which is how planetary nebulae got the name, in a sense that they looked like planets about to form. The guy that gave them that name was a Frenchman called Darquin, and he was later adopted by William Herschel. Now, very, very quickly, Andromeda Galaxy. This is the square of Pegasus. If you take this line out here, that's Andromeda. Nothing like a pretty young maiden, but you have to use your imagination, you see. If you go up to the star here, Nu, just about here is the famous Andromeda Spiral, and as Steve says, you won't see a lot of it, but it's interesting because you should be able to see M32, which is right next to it. There's a companion galaxy of M31, but you will need good binoculars or low power on a small telescope with and you have to gaze at it for quite a long time, and you'll eventually see these little features. But that's about all you are going to see, and I'm sorry to say. As far as Andromeda is concerned, this is a very nice double star, which is much closer than Alberio, but colours are pretty similar. And that's Gamma Andromedae. Very attractive. So there's plenty of things to look out for, and I hope it's given you some ideas. And if you really want to have a look up high, you can see Cassiopeia up here, and there's several objects of interest in there, including various open clusters. M52 is up here, and down here is M103. There are others. Little one down here is NGC 457, which is sometimes called the ET Nebula or the ET cluster. So there's quite a lot of interesting features in here as well. Plus that star there, which is Eta Cassiopeia, is a beautiful double, sort of orange with a purpley companion. Of course, these colours are very subjective, so don't believe me when I tell you that. Have a look yourself. That's the best thing, and decide what colours you see them. I hope that's given you some brief ideas to look at over the next month or so. And they're all tried and tested. I've seen them all, so you know that they can be seen. They're not a figment of my imagination. So with that, I'll hand back to Sean. So I'm just going to.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Richard. Fascinating to see what's available in the sky. And funnily enough, just before we started the meeting, I did stick my head out, and obviously the moon was very prominent, and the planets as well beside it. So yeah, I encourage you to go and have a look at that. I'll just mention a few words about our next meeting next month. We will be doing that on Zoom as well. So far, the school don't really want us in there because they've got pupils and they've got teachers in. They don't want cross-contamination, so they've said, for the moment anyway, let's keep apart. But next month, we're going to have Ian Melville talk to us about his observatory, and also another interesting project he's done about using a Raspberry Pi to control elements of his observatory. So I hope you might find that of interest. We'll put details up on the website. And if you do want to look at the website, you know, I'm just going to bring up this here once more and show you that. you know, go to the website, click on the events, and down there you'll find some online events. And we encourage you to visit the website. And also for those that are on Facebook and Twitter, you'll find constant news streams of interesting things happening, including, you know, the rocket launches and various things that are going on in the space industry. So until next time, thanks very much for attending. Really appreciate it, and also appreciate your patience with the technical problems we've had. And hopefully next time it'll be a better one. So good night, everyone.